I'm Vicky, Joint Chief Exec from Wiltshire Community Foundation. We're one of Wiltshire and Swindon's largest funders, providing grants and support to community groups and individuals throughout the county.
Hi, I'm James. I'm a partner at MHA Monahans. MHA is an association of accountancy firms across the country, and we work with lots and lots of charities and other not-for-profit organisations.
Thanks for joining us today, James.
Pleasure.
Today we're going to talk about reserves. So what do people mean when they talk about a reserves policy?
Okay, so all charities will have assets, but generally charities aren't in the business of kind of building those assets up in perpetuity. So charities need to be able to justify the funds that they're holding. Conversely, charities need to make sure that they've got enough funds so they don't run out of money and become bankrupt. So what we're sort of talking about here is that charities need to have what's called a free reserve policy, which sets an upper limit, which is of the maximum they would want to hold in reserve, and also a lower limit, which is of the minimum they think that they need to continue operating.
Okay, you've used the term free reserves. What does that actually mean?
Yeah, it can sometimes be confusing because charities sometimes use the word reserves and free reserves interchangeably. Now, strictly speaking, when we use the word reserves, we're talking about all of the assets the charity hold, whereas free reserves are effectively the unspent funds which can be freely used to pay for anything.
Okay, so why would a charity have reserves that aren't freely available to use?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And there's three sort of main situations that a charity might have reserves that it can't spend. Now, the first one is where a charity holds fixed assets, things like lands and buildings. Now that will have a value on its balance sheet, but by the virtue of the fact that those are all caught up in buildings, you can't use it to pay for things like the phone bill. So that is a situation where a charity might have reserves which it can't sort of spend on day-to-day running costs. The second situation is where a funder has given money for a very particular purpose. So, a funder could have given you a grant, to fix a leaky roof or something. And again, those funds are really useful, but you can't use them to, say, pay for the telephone bill. So again, they're not really freely available to spend. The third situation is that sometimes trustees may ring fence funds for a particular purpose. So again, going back to that example of a leaky roof, the trustees themselves might have said, well, we've got this pot of money sitting over here, but we can't spend it because we really need to save it for making that big capital investment. So again, those funds, those ring fence funds, would be excluded from the calculation as well.
Okay, so free reserves are really unrestricted reserves that aren't caught up in fixed assets and aren't there to be spent on a specific project.
That's absolutely right. And it's these free reserves that the Charity Commission is really interested in. They want to be sure that charities are making sure that there's enough in this pot that they aren't going to become bankrupt, but conversely they're really concerned that charities don't just sort of build up a reserve which is so big that it never gets spent on the good causes it was given for.
Okay, so what level of free reserves would be too much?
This is a really good question and a difficult one to answer, as each charity needs to sort of reflect on a number of factors in making that decision. Now, historically there have been situations where a number of high-profile charities have come under criticism for holding reserves which are in excess of their needs. This was particularly relevant around some sort of animal welfare charities around a decade ago, and the Charity Commission really sort of got the bit between their teeth, and they were sort of looking at charities at one point and asking them to really justify why they were holding the level of reserves they were holding. Now, as a rule of thumb, I often say to people that if your free reserves are starting to edge over 12 months running costs, that's probably a sign that maybe the policy is a bit over cautious.
Okay, so what factors should charities consider?
Okay, so as a starting point, I think it's really sensible to look at working capital. So if we look at the charity sector, there are charities out there like academy schools who get very regular monthly payments from the government. And so charities like that actually don't need to have so much working capital when we compare it to organisations who maybe do quarterly fundraising drives or who may receive grants on a quarterly basis. Charities like that will need to have more in their pot to kind of manage the ebbs and flows during the year.
So that's really helpful. What else should charities consider?
Right, well I think the next port of call would be to go to the charities risk register. The basic idea here is that the charities who are facing greater risks will invariably need to have more money in reserve to help manage some of those risks. Now, without a doubt, there will be some risks on the register which don't need you to have money in reserve to manage, but also there will be some where it might be useful to have a bit more in reserve to sort of, if those risks do crystallise. But it's worth also mentioning it shouldn't all be about risk though. And I do see charities from time to time, devising their policy in such a way that they do also put away reserves for opportunities. So for instance, if there's a project which looks really interesting and you haven't managed to get the funding sorted out, it can be useful to have some reserves to kind of prime that project before you can kind of go out and get all the money you need to really get it up and running.
That all sounds quite complex, James.
Yes, absolutely, and it can be, but any reserves policy should really reflect the complexity and the size of the organisation. So if you are a small grassroots organisation, you can probably afford to take more of a broad brush approach and have a simpler policy. However, regardless of size, I think it is helpful to spend time considering the policy carefully and find something that really works for your organisation.
Okay, are there any other considerations?
Well, I think I'm a strong advocate that charities ought to be setting an upper and lower bound for their reserves policy. This means that it almost provides like train tracks for the charity. If your reserves start to hit your upper limit, that means that the charity trustees ought to be sort of taking a step back and seeing how they might want to use those funds for the best benefit of the beneficiaries. And conversely, if you're in a situation where you're starting to move towards your lower limit, maybe you have to have some of those more difficult discussions about how to cut costs or do an emergency fundraise.
So that would work a little bit like an early alarm system, I guess.
Absolutely.
So when you set your reserves policy, how often should you review it?
Well, personally, I think that an annual review should be the minimum cycle. And I think when you're sort of starting to do your budgets for the next financial period, that's a really good time to look at forecasts, try to ascertain what it is you will be doing, and at that point reflect on whether the reserves are adequate. But I'd also suggest it's worth revisiting if there's big changes. So, a big new project might be a good time to take a step back and ask the question about whether increased reserves might be helpful.
That's great. Is there anything else we should be aware of?
The only other thing I would mention is that charities of a certain size are required to talk about their reserves policy in their annual accounts. And if your reserves end up being outside your reserve policy, either too low or too high, trustees are expected to talk about what they're doing to bring their reserves in line with the policy. So I think it is an important thing to think about from a regulatory perspective. However, I do think that a reserves policy, if properly managed, is a really useful financial tool for trustees, because as I say, it does give you that sort of train tracks to operate within, and as you sort of said, it's an early warning system if a charity is sort of headed in the wrong direction.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, James.
Pleasure.
I'd like to say a huge thank you to the Platform Project for helping us produce these videos, and also to MHA Monahans for all of their support.
And a massive thank you to the Wiltshire Community Foundation for their continuing support of the sector.
I'd like to say a massive thank you to Reuban and his team at the Platform Project for helping produce these videos. There'll be a link to some of Reuban's other work in the description box.